The dust in the Redemption Saloon was a living thing, a fine brown shroud that settled on everything and everyone, tasting of stale beer and regret. It clung to the peeling varnish of the bar, filled the grooves in the scarred wooden tables, and muted the light from the grimy windows, turning the afternoon sun into a sickly, jaundiced glare. At the center of this miasma, on a makeshift stage of stacked crates, stood a girl. The saloon keeper, a bloated man named Jedediah, whose face was a cruel map of broken veins, held the rope tied loosely around her wrists. He grinned, revealing teeth like yellowed tombstones. A bit fleshy for some tastes, he boomed, his voice a gravelly insult that echoed in the tense quiet, but untouched, I guarantee it. A clean slate for whichever gentleman has the coin and the will to break her in. The men in the crowd, a collection of hard-bitten ranchers and hollow-eyed drifters, laughed a low, guttural laugh. The girl, Ilara, did not flinch. Her chin was held high, a small act of defiance in a world that sought to grind her into the dirt. Her eyes, however, betrayed a deep, shimmering fear. In a shadowed corner, a man sat alone, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. He was a spectre at this sordid feast, his face weathered into a mask of harsh landscapes, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. This was Silas, a name whispered like a curse in places like this. He hadn't come for the whiskey or the company. He'd come for the quiet, but the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Jedediah's words, the girl's silent terror, the crowd's predatory hunger, it all churned a familiar poison in his gut. It was the echo of a different night, of smoke and screams and a promise he had failed to keep. A fire he couldn't put out. A family he couldn't save. He closed his eyes, but the memory was branded on the inside of his eyelids. Jedediah started the bidding. Silas opened his eyes. The ghosts were screaming. With a weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a dozen lifetimes, he pushed his chair back. The sound scraped across the floorboards, silencing the room. Every eye turned to the shadow in the corner as he rose, a tall, lean silhouette of lethal potential. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and tossed it onto the stage. It landed with a solid, definitive thud, the sound of a closing door. That covers her, Silas said, his voice low and raspy, a sound that promised nothing but finality. And your silence. Jedediah's greedy eyes darted from the pouch to Silas, his leer faltering as recognition dawned. He knew the stories. He knew the man. The saloon keeper's bluster evaporated, replaced by a curdled mix of avarice and fear. He swallowed hard, his thick neck bobbing. Without another word, he snatched the pouch and untied the rope from Ilara's wrists, shoving her forward as if she were a sack of grain. Silas caught her arm gently, his touch surprisingly steady. He didn't look at her. His gaze swept over the crowd, a cold fire that made every man there suddenly find the contents of their beer mugs fascinating. He turned, his hand still on her arm, and led her toward the swinging doors. The saloon held its breath until they were gone, the dust settling once more in their wake. Outside, the dying sun bled across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows down the desolate street. Silas released her, his hand falling away as if her skin burned him. He walked toward a tethered horse, a lean, black creature as grim as its master. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a name or a destination. Ilara stood her ground, rubbing the raw skin of her wrists. She was free of the rope, but now she was bound to this terrifying, silent man. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice quiet but not weak. He paused, his back to her. "Away," was all he said. He swung himself into the saddle, a fluid motion of practiced economy. He looked down at her then, his face half lost in the twilight, a landscape of regret. "I'm not your friend," he stated, the words flat and hard, a clear boundary line drawn in the dirt between them. "I'm not your savior," she met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't ask for one," she replied, a spark of her defiant spirit showing through. He seemed to consider this for a long moment, then gestured with his head for her to mount behind him. As she settled onto the horse, the strange, cold reality of her situation descended. She had been sold and bought in the space of 10 minutes, her life's trajectory wrenched violently into the unknown, tied to the whims of a man who looked like he had made a career of burying his own soul. They rode out of the dying town and into the vast, indifferent darkness of the plains. The only sounds were the rhythmic hoofbeats and the sigh of the wind through dry grass. They stopped hours later at a dilapidated line shack, a forgotten relic crumbling back into the earth. It wasn't a home, it was a hole to disappear into. Inside, Silas lit a single lantern, the flickering light casting huge, dancing shadows that made the small space feel both intimate and menacing. He gave her a canteen and a piece of hardtack, the sum total of his hospitality. He sat on the floor across from her, cleaning his pistol with a focused intensity that made it clear he was more comfortable with the cold steel than with human company. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Ilara knew this was her moment. This man had bought her, but he hadn't asked why she was on that stage. He had acted on some buried impulse, a spasm of a conscience he tried to keep hidden. Now, she had to give him a reason to keep her alive, to turn his act of pity into a mission. She reached into the folds of her worn dress, her fingers finding the small, oilskin-wrapped package she had sewn into the hem. She pulled it free. It was a small, leather-bound journal. She held it out to him. "This is why," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is why they were selling me." Silas didn't move, his eyes remaining on his weapon. "I don't care, you should," she pressed, her voice gaining strength. "You bought me from Jedediah, but he doesn't own anything. He's just a dog. The man who holds his leash is Judge Thorne. He's the one who wanted me sold, silenced, and shipped away where no one would ever find me." The name hung in the air. Judge Thorne. The most powerful man in the territory, a pillar of justice wrapped in a shroud of unimpeachable respectability. Silas finally looked up, his gaze sharp and piercing. He saw the journal, and for the first time, a flicker of something beyond weary detachment crossed his face. He saw not a victim, but a threat. He saw a truth dangerous enough to get them both killed. He didn't take the journal. He simply stared at it, then at her, his mind working behind those stormy eyes. "The judge," he said, the words less a question than a confirmation of a grim reality. "He was my guardian," Ilara explained, her voice low and urgent, the words tumbling out now that the dam was broken. "My father worked for him, kept his books. When my parents died in a fire last year, a fire the judge himself arranged, he took me in. An act of public charity. But I found this. My father's private ledger." She opened the journal, the pages filled with a neat, precise script. "It's all in here, Silas. Every bribe he took, every parcel of land he stole through legal trickery, every man he had silenced. He uses Jedediah and his thugs as his instruments, but Thorne is the architect. He's a snake who wears a robe of justice." Silas finally holstered his pistol and took the journal. He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable in the wavering lantern light. He saw names, dates, figures. A meticulous record of a rot that went straight to the heart of the territory. He stopped on one page, his thumb tracing a name. A rancher who had accidentally drowned, his land subsequently acquired for pennies on the dollar by one of Thorne's associates. Silas knew the man's family. "Why you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why not just kill you?" "Because a dead ward raises questions," she said, her intelligence sharp and clear. "A disgraced girl sold off to a brothel in the next territory? She just disappears. No one looks for broken things." Suddenly, the shack's flimsy door burst inward with a splintering crash. Two of Jedediah's men filled the doorway, their faces brutish and triumphant. They hadn't been hunting for a runaway girl. They had been hunting for the book in Silas's hands. Before they could even raise their pistols, Silas moved. He was not a man anymore, but a whirlwind of controlled violence. He kicked the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness, the only light now a sliver of cold moonlight from the broken doorway. There was a sickening crunch, a choked gasp, and the thud of a body hitting the floor. The second man fired wildly into the blackness, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating Silas's face, a mask of cold fury. A second later, there was the sharp, clean report of Silas's own pistol. The second man collapsed, a dark stain spreading on his chest. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Brutal. Economical. Final. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung heavy in the air. Silas stood over the two bodies, his breathing even, his form a dark silhouette against the moonlit doorway. He was no longer just a weary man, he was the feared hunter the stories described. Elara, huddled in the corner, felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a stark realization: this man's capacity for violence was the only reason she was still alive. He turned to her, the journal still clutched in his hand. "We have to go," he said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "They know you have it." "They won't stop." He dragged the bodies outside, leaving them for the coyotes. There was no time for burial, no room for ceremony. They were on the run now, not from a brutish saloon keeper, but from the long, insidious arm of a corrupt judge who would tear the whole territory apart to get his ledger back. They rode hard through the night, pushing their horse to its limit, the landscape a blur of silver and black. Elara clung to him, the reality of her choice settling in. She hadn't just saved her own life, she had declared war. At dawn, they paused in a rocky canyon, the horse lathered and trembling. Elara looked at the journal Silas had tucked into his coat. "There's a name in there," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Cain. My father noted that Judge Thorne cheated him on a smuggling deal. A big one. It says he's a forger, a safecracker. That he lives in the Undercity, the criminal warrens beneath the capital." Silas considered this, his gaze distant. He knew they couldn't run forever. Thorne's power was too vast. Running was a slow death. Attacking was a quick one. But exposing him, that was a different kind of fight. It required more than a fast gun. Thorne's influence doesn't reach as deep there, Silas mused, thinking aloud. He rules the world of law. Cain rules the world without it. It was a desperate gamble. Seeking help from one criminal to take down another. But it was their only path. "We'll find him," Silas decided, the word sealing their fate. The journey to the capital was a tense passage through a hostile world. Every distant rider was a threat, every town a potential trap. They traveled by night and hid by day, the bond between them forged in shared silence and constant vigilance. The capital city was a monument to Judge Thorne's hypocrisy, its grand courthouse and clean, wide streets a facade built upon a foundation of crime and corruption. Beneath it lay the Undercity, a tangled maze of shadowed alleys, illicit taverns, and hidden doorways, a place where the law was a bad joke and survival was the only currency. Finding Cain was like tracking a ghost in a graveyard. His name was spoken in whispers, his location a jealously guarded secret. It took them 2 days of cautious questions and greased palms before they were directed to a grimy print shop whose sign read Cain and Sons, fine lithographies. There were no sons, only Cain, a man whose face was a spiderweb of scars and whose eyes held the cynical glint of a survivor. He sat behind a massive printing press, cleaning ink from his fingers, and didn't look up as they entered. "We're not open," he rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "We're here about Judge Thorne," Silas said, his presence filling the small shop, sucking the air out of it. Cain froze. He slowly looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Then you're in the wrong place. And you're dumber than you look. Get out." Elara stepped forward, holding the journal. "He cheated you," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The Black Creek shipment. He took your profits and had the sheriff run you out of the county. My father wrote it all down." Cain's expression shifted from hostile to intrigued. He stared at the journal, then at Elara, a flicker of an old, bitter anger in his eyes. He motioned for them to sit. "Talk," he commanded. They laid out the plan. It was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Thorne was hosting his annual Founders' Day Gala at his manor in 3 days. The entire city's elite would be there. It was the perfect cover. While the judge was playing the benevolent host, they would infiltrate his private study, where Elara was certain he kept a master ledger, the original copy from which her father had made his notes. That ledger was the undeniable proof they needed. Cain listened, his face a stony mask. "You want to walk into the lion's den to steal his teeth," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's impossible, is it?" Silas countered, his voice a low challenge. "Or is it just expensive?" Kane studied Silas for a long moment, then glanced at Ilara's determined face. He saw two people who had nothing left to lose, the most dangerous kind of people there were. "It'll cost you," he finally said. "Everything you have. And if we're caught, I don't know you." Silas nodded. Fair enough. An alliance was forged in that dusty, ink-stained room, a pact between a haunted gunman, a courageous girl, and a cynical criminal, all bound by their shared enemy. The night of the gala arrived, draping the city in a cloak of festive lights and dark intentions. Judge Thorne's manor stood on a hill overlooking the capital, a beacon of wealth and power, its windows blazing with golden light, the sounds of music and laughter spilling into the cold night air. While the city's finest drank champagne and danced, three shadows detached themselves from the darkness at the edge of the estate. Kane, nimble and silent, dealt with the lock on a service gate. Silas, a ghost in the night, moved with a predatory grace. And Ilara, who knew the manor's layout by heart, guided them through the labyrinthine gardens, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve a burning fire. They moved through the servants' corridors, a world away from the glittering ballroom. The tension was a physical presence, tightening with every step. Every distant footfall, every burst of laughter from the party, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Ilara led them to the west wing, to the heavy oak door of Judge Thorne's private study. "This is it," she whispered. "He keeps the safe behind the portrait of his father." Kane produced a set of slender, intricate tools, his scarred fingers surprisingly delicate as he knelt before the massive, ornate safe. "This is a Blackwood Imperial," he muttered, his voice a mix of frustration and professional respect. "The man's a bastard, but he has taste. This will take time." Silas stood guard at the door, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his senses stretched to their limit. He was a coiled spring, his entire being focused on the sounds of the house. The minutes crawled by, each one an eternity. The soft clicks from the safe's tumblers were cannon shots in the suffocating silence. Ilara watched Kane's hands, her own twisting together, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was the precipice. Everything, her parents' memory, her future, Silas's chance at some kind of peace, rested on the contents of that steel box. The heavy footsteps in the hall came without warning. Silas stiffened, pressing his ear to the door. It was the heavy, clumsy tread of one man. Jedediah. Of course, Thorne would have his dog guarding his most precious secrets. Silas motioned for Kane to keep working and for Ilara to hide behind a thick velvet curtain. He drew his pistol, positioning himself to the side of the door. The handle turned. The door swung open, and Jedediah filled the frame, his brutish face contorting in a triumphant sneer as he saw the open safe. "Well, well," he grunted. "Look what the cat dragged." He never finished the sentence. Silas moved, not with the wildness of a barroom brawler, but with the cold, brutal efficiency of a butcher. He didn't fire his gun, a shot would bring the whole house down on them. He slammed the butt of the pistol into Jedediah's temple. The big man staggered, stunned, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. Silas didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, propelling him back into the study and kicking the door shut. The fight was short, ugly, and almost silent. It was a desperate struggle of grunts, strained muscles, and the sickening thud of fists on flesh. Jedediah was strong, a beast of a man, but Silas was fueled by ghosts and a grief so old it had become a part of his bones. He saw not Jedediah, but the fire, the failure, the faces he couldn't save. This time, he would not fail. He ducked under a wild swing, drove a knife hand into Jedediah's throat, and as the big man gagged, Silas finished it, a final, decisive movement that left the saloon keeper collapsing to the floor in a heap. A click echoed in the now silent room. "Got it," Kane breathed, swinging the heavy safe door open. Inside, nestled amongst stacks of gold coin, was a single, large, black ledger. As Kane grabbed it, the study door opened again. This time, it was Judge Thorne himself, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. He held a small, silver derringer, and it was pointed directly at Ilara's heart. Judge Thorne's composure was immaculate, a chilling contrast to the violence that had just occurred. He barely glanced at Jedediah's body, his cold eyes fixed on Elara and the ledger in Cain's hand. An impressive effort, the judge said, his voice smooth as polished marble. But a foolish one. Give me the book, child. No one needs to know about this unfortunate mess. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who managed, who controlled, who erased his problems. You murdered my father, Elara said, her voice trembling but unbroken. She stepped out from behind the curtain, placing herself between Thorn and the others. This was her fight. You destroyed my family. For this she gestured to the ledger. Thorn's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. Your father was a clerk who grew ambitious. A regrettable, but necessary, business expense. Just as you are now. Give me the book, and I will permit your friend, the gunman, to live. A fair trade, I think. Silas, bleeding from a cut on his cheek, slowly raised his hands. He was weighing the odds, the distance, the Derringer's aim. But this wasn't his decision to make. It was Elara's. No, she said, her voice ringing with newfound power. No more deals. No more secrets. It ends. Tonight she took a step toward him, a direct challenge. What do you think happens when a person with nothing to lose confronts a man who has everything to lose? Does courage stand a chance against corruption, or is it just another body to be buried? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thorn's eyes hardened. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the predator beneath. A pity, he hissed, and his thumb moved to cock the hammer. In that instant, a thundering crash echoed from the front of the manor, the sound of the great oak doors being smashed open. Shouts erupted. Not the panicked cries of party guests, but the organized, authoritative commands of the territorial marshals. Heavy, rhythmic bootfalls pounded through the house, growing closer with every heartbeat. Cain permitted himself a small, grim smile. Part of my fee, he whispered. I sent a messenger an hour ago. Judge Thorn's face, for the first time, registered shock. The foundation of his world crumbled in a matter of seconds. His power, his influence, his carefully constructed facade, all of it turning to dust as the law, the real law, stormed his sanctuary. The resolution was swift. Judge Thorn, stripped of his authority and his arrogance, was taken into custody, his face a canvas of disbelief. The master ledger, combined with Elara's father's journal, was irrefutable. It was the key that unraveled a decade of corruption, leading to a wave of arrests that cleansed the territory of its deepest rot. The authorities, grateful for the anonymous tip and the damning evidence, posted a substantial reward for information leading to the judge's capture. A reward came quietly directed to a post office box registered under a false name. He collected his share and vanished back into the shadows of the Undercity, a ghost returning to his graveyard. For Silas and Elara, the end of the ordeal left a profound silence. The violence was over, the ghosts of the immediate past lay to rest, but their own scars remained. They took the reward money, not as payment, but as seed money for a life that had yet to be planted. They left the city without a backward glance, its glittering lights and dark secrets fading behind them. They traveled for weeks, seeking not a destination, but a feeling. They found it in a high mountain valley, a forgotten pocket of the world cradled by silent, ancient peaks. It was a place where the air was clean and the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. They bought a small plot of land with a half-finished cabin, its raw timbers smelling of promise. The work was hard, but it was honest. They built together, their shared labor a silent conversation, healing the wounds that words could not touch. Silas found that the ghosts of the fire did not scream as loudly here. Elara found that her past was not a chain, but a foundation upon which she could build a new strength. One morning, they stood outside their nearly finished home, watching the sun rise. It crested the jagged peaks, spilling gold, and rose across the valley, chasing the last of the shadows from the hollows. It was the dawn of a new day, the first of many. They had walked through the deepest darkness together and had emerged into the light, not unscathed, but unbroken. They had found their peace, not in vengeance, but in the quiet promise of a shared future. And in the silence of that new morning, they both knew they were finally home. Thank you for watching. We hope this story of redemption and courage inspired you. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that matter.